So, Natalie, when people think about food security, they usually think, oh, it's those preppers, those people in bunkers, those people who are storing guns. And when we talk about it, we don't think food security is for preppers. So, what do you say to people when people say food security? Oh, that's just for people who are trying to get out of society and live in a hole and be out in the bush. What do you say to that?
Well, you know what? They do need food security, but so does everybody else. So, yeah, I mean, of course, those people also need food. All of us eat multiple times a day, typically. And so, food security is for anybody who has that requirement of food in their life. And although I think it's easy for us to put distinctions between groups of people, when it comes to food, it's one of those unifiers. We all need it, period. What that food looks like, how it's stored. So perhaps for that prepper group, it's Mylar bags of, vacuum sealed Mylar in a tin, buried in the ground. And so that's a different type of food storage. But in your house, regardless of where you live or how you live, there is some food stored there. And so that's a reflection of the fact that you also need to eat. So food security is literally for everyone. Everyone needs food security. The way we view food security, the steps that we take, that's going to be based in our values, our belief systems, where we live, the ecology around us. Are we in a big urban center? Are we on a farm in a rural place? So the details of what food security looks like in our lives, that changes. And so for a prepper, it might look different from somebody, who's working in community gardens in the middle of the city on Friday afternoons, right? So our contexts are going to be really, really different. But food security is literally for anybody who eats. Now, I'm curious to hear your take on this because we come from different backgrounds, and a lot of people would consider me a prepper because I have a lot of food stored for my family. This is a function of my lifestyle. I live off grid in the bush on a homestead, and the city with large grocery stores is 2 hours away from me. So I have to have that amount of food so that I can have food security. And your context is a little bit different, or historically has been quite different from mine in the lifestyle that you've lived and the steps that you've taken to build food security. So I'm really curious to reverse this question for you. How do you view food security? And when somebody says, "Oh, that's for preppers," how would you answer that question?
It's a great question, and I enjoyed your answer. I think as much as I'm going to enjoy answering, because when you take a look at food security, it's one of those things where you almost have to wonder if there's been some sort of story, some sort of narrative, like, oh, if you store more than just a day's food supply, you're weird. And the degree of weird, I think, moves, all the way out to doomsday prepper, you know, uh, all the rest of that. But I remember when I was younger, my aunt, who's still to this day one of those individuals that inspires me to be very knowledgeable about food and have deep relationships and all the rest of it. She would have an incredible food supply to which everyone in our family would make fun of. Oh, you're waiting for the apocalypse. Oh, you're waiting for the asteroid to come. Oh, the zombies. Everyone's going to go over to Leslie's. And yet, again, there was a satisfaction that came from that. And so when people say food security is just for preppers, I really am curious about where they came up with that idea. I'm really curious about where they divorced food from an everyday need that we all have. What was the stories? What were the conversations? What were the tales and narratives that they were exposed to that made it that way? And for my aunt, which was really interesting, is that because my grandmother and my great grandmother both went through the Great Depression, there was something about storing and hoarding and holding on to food and being in a frugal mindset that was demonized as lowbrow and poor of mindset and poor of of status. There is something about, oh, I just go to the grocery store, and the grocery store produces that food, to the point to where when I was younger and I was in the care of my grandmother, it was always, we will make it at home, right? We will go into the kitchen and we will make that. And I think my grandmother was that last generation where when you said we'll make it at home, it was actually better than what you could get out in the world. I think probably my mother's generation was where when you said, oh, we have pizza at home, it's like pita bread with ketchup and a couple of hot dogs. That's your pizza. And I think my generation, in terms of you and others I know, it's no, we have sourdough stored at home, and we have sauce we've canned, and we have amazing meats we've cured, and pizza at home is actually better than what you can get out in the real world, to the point to where we don't really are tempted anymore to go out there. And so I think when people say food security is for preppers, or when I remember this, I was at a wedding once and somebody was interviewing me because I had to be, I was part of the wedding party, and somebody was going to talk about me as a master of ceremony. And when I was telling them about myself, they introduced me as a Luddite. I'm coming to you from a computer with lights and cameras, and it's just so interesting, the marginalization that the human mind has when it comes to things it doesn't understand, doesn't know, or has a narrative structure that says, no, that's poor, or no, that's regressive or primitive or savage, right? And all of those exceptionally derogatory terms are really about turning people off of reliance and having access to food and all the rest of that. And I imagine that's been something that you've really encountered because of being so off grid and being so remote, and having just an incredible connection as you do to your ancestry and to the land.
I had a really interesting experience last year. And so there are certain things that I go to the store to buy. For example, toilet paper. I buy toilet paper. And yeah, I know how to get by without it, but I like it. I really enjoy using it. I don't want to have to not use it. And so this is one of those things that I will make an annual or biannual trip to the city, and I'll buy the toilet paper that I need. And so for anybody who's been in North America and went through this last 2 years, you'll remember the memes about toilet paper hoarding. And so when I went to the grocery store at the normal time, or to Costco or Wholesale Club at the normal time, when I would go buy a whole bunch of toilet paper, I got dirty looks. Now, this was already after all supply chains of toilet paper had returned to normal, but there became this narrative around buying things in bulk, and that makes you greedy, that you're hoarding it so that you can hold it above other people's heads. And we experienced another natural disaster, not where I am, but where you are. And people were making comments all over social media, nasty comments about those people who had gone to the grocery store and they bought too much. Obviously, they bought too much because there was nothing left in the store. And what those people making those nasty comments didn't realize is that store only had 2 days worth of groceries to begin with. And so it doesn't take very long. If everybody hears, well, the roads are going to be closed, so everybody goes to get that, 2 days worth of groceries all at the same time, you don't actually have to buy very much. And then the grocery store has nothing left. And it's because there was a narrative around that makes you greedy. You're a bad person because of what you just did, even if that was just a normal amount of food to get you through to the next paycheck. There's this malleable perception around what things mean. Now, when it comes to cultural perceptions, there are things that people would never consider eating, but in my culture, it's kind of normal. And so, there's foods like tripe. We eat tripe. It's not bad. And there's certain beaver or muskrat or, moose heart. Moose heart is really good. But to a lot of people, they're just like, oh, why? Why would you eat that? And these cultural perceptions are based almost exclusively in ignorance. almost all derogatory perceptions, whether they're culturally based, economically based, just based in the othering of different people. So they're different than you in some way. These opinions that we develop over food and many other topics are almost always based in ignorance. So when I've encountered things like that of, oh my gosh, you would eat a muskrat? It's like, yes, I would. And that's not a big deal. Or, a different type of identity is as being a small farmer, being a producer. And I've had people talk to me about, that gross liver. I'm just like, you don't understand food if you're not willing to eat those parts of an animal. You don't know how much it took to pitch hay to that animal every day, to afford the hay that animal ate when it increased 300% over the course of 1 year. You don't know all the worry, the work, the sleepless nights, getting out of bed even when you're sick. And you know what? All of that effort, it also grew a liver. It didn't just selectively grow tenderloin. So all of those comments about, oh, that's gross, it's almost always ignorance. The last piece is that I have encountered is that something is just so adorable. And, how could you possibly raise food that, it had a face? And yes, it had a cute face. It really did. And I loved raising it. And it's feeding my family and keeping us alive. And so the ignorance in this one is not just that these are actually necessary things within our food system. It's the belief that going to a grocery store where it doesn't have a face anymore and it's packaged in cellophane is somehow a better option, that it puts somebody above another person because they were able to put off the uncomfortable parts of food. It could be put off the uncomfortable parts that I don't want to eat, like the liver and the tripe and the heart, which again, my favorite parts of the animal right there. But it's also those uncomfortable situations of waking up in the middle of the night in minus 45-degree weather to go and check on the lambs that are giving birth. The sheep are giving birth and there's lambs coming. There's these uncomfortable experiences. There's these things that we don't enjoy or we don't want to be a part of. And so we treat each other with ignorance because somebody else has chosen that is a good thing and that is a part of their life because of their culture, because of their lifestyle, because of their values. And that othering around food is a remarkable detriment. So yeah, given my background in lifestyle, these are things that I have encountered, but at many different levels, from people thinking I'm a prepper, a doomsday prepper because I have a year's worth of food, people being grossed out by the cultural lineage of foods within my culture, and then also lifestyle choices of being a homesteader and being on a small farm. There's a lot of ways that we can judge other people's food preferences and lifestyles in that regards, for sure. Javan, I'm curious, as we turn the conversation back towards the perceptions around preppers, are there any other perceptions perhaps around food that you've experienced? One that comes to mind is this idea around really premium foods and foodies and gastronomy and all these really fetishized ideas around food. I'm curious if there's anything else beyond preppers or certain cultures when it comes to food assumptions that we have around others or these judgments that we make.
Are there any other assumptions about food? Oof. Well, I don't know if these videos are going to be short. I think and we were both deep in that culture. I was on my way to become a pastry chef at Cordon Bleu University. You were a high-end caterer for a while. We both worked in a way, and I would say still to a certain extent, I do really enjoy working with food in a way that is just delight in all aspects. But I think there's sort of a middle conversation. I think there's probably something else that deters people from food security. Well, food is food. You put it in your mouth and you keep going, right? It's not a thoughtful process. It's not a process that is given a lot of presence. You don't sit with your food for a while. You have your food as you watch television after a long day, which is the reality for a lot of people. And you don't think on it. You don't interact with it. You open whatever box is in your cupboards and you dump that into something else, and you boil, you bake, you use another mechanism, and you bring it into another activity, which isn't eating. It's something else that will occupy your time while you're putting food into your mouth. So I think one of the perceptions I've seen a lot of, which, early on in life, I was dissuaded from due to the fact that I was in an amazing Boy Scout troop, and we had these gourmet leaders that in minus 30 degrees Celsius camps would challenge us to make pot roast in cast iron over flames. And forever and a day, I will be incredibly grateful and blessed to be under the tutelage of that group of men, because they really did push us to go, be careful about what you put in your mouth, and be careful about ingredients, and be careful about preparation. And so I think there's a lot of thoughts about care that get missed around food. The care of raising, for sure, the care of acknowledging, for sure, but just the care of, oh, this is important, what I put into my mouth. And it's been talked about a lot when we talk about nutrition. Avoid the center of the grocery store and stick to the outside of the grocery store. That's where the living food is, or the close to living food. It hasn't been processed in such a way that it has a shelf stable life for 5 years, because that's what food does, right? It's stable for 5 years. And so I think one of the perceptions that I've seen a lot of is this idea of food shouldn't have a thought to it. We shouldn't even think about it. We should spend the least amount of money, the least amount of time to get the most amount of calories and the most amount of flavor into our taste, which is normally salt and sugar. Like the idea of bitters, the idea of sours, the idea of astringency, those flavors on our palate are almost lost. And so I love that this question has opened up this conversation about food so wide, because really what we're talking about is a calcified judgment that takes an entire viewpoint, entire approach, entire perspective of food security, and then just labels it with one group that is usually portrayed by media. And so I think this is one of the things that comes to me when we come to questions about this topic is, when you think about a certain food, when you think about a certain category of food, when you think about certain people who produce food, do you have an experience of that, whatever, be that the food, the people, its processing, how it's grown, that is independent of media? I think that's probably it for me. That's the question, because when I think about food, if I remove media, and this was about 10 years ago, there was so little that I knew. If I remove what I'd watched in movies and videos, and 10 years ago, not a lot of YouTube, now lots of YouTube, would I have an experience? No. When I thought about deer, I thought about a movie that had 2 seconds, and the way they portrayed it was the way that I thought about deer and deer hunting and what that meant. When I think about food in cans and jars, I thought about, grandparents, because I had an experience of that and I knew that was tasty. And I went to friends' places and they gave me pickles, and I was like, what is this? Why does your grandmother make such terrible pickles? They're like, oh, that's store-bought. We don't make pickles. It's like, oh, like we have these experiences in life as kids and as adults that if we don't have otherwise, we have to take information from other people's sources. And if it's given to us, it's usually for agenda. So I think one of those questions is, if you wanted to challenge, if you're watching this and you're like, yeah, food security is for preppers, really challenge what you know about prepping outside of media. Do you know anybody? Have you ever done any of that yourself? If you think about the word food security, you don't have an experience of that outside of media that's been crafted for a certain aim besides education. Where does that come from? I think that would be a question I would put to people. For you, Natalie, what's one question or a series of questions or a perspective or an approach that people could start to ask themselves to help them if they have this belief, or if they're even going to be honest with themselves, being like, yeah, I kind of think food security is just for preppers, it's just for those crazy people. What question would you give them? What question would you have them ask?
I guess the easiest one for me to think of is, well, who gets to decide how much is the right amount of food to have? So if somebody can't make that decision for themselves and say, well, a year is the right amount, or 25 years, or 2 weeks, if you don't get to decide that for yourself, well, then who the heck gets to decide that for you? And when somebody else gets to decide those things for you, of whether something is the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do, um, how do we then get to influence that dialogue around what you should or shouldn't do? For example, if it's wrong to have 6 months worth of food, 3 months worth of food, if that puts you into a category of people labeled as an unsavory, or a tinfoil hat, somebody to mock, somebody to despise, based on that arbitrary decision, it's important to know, well, who made that arbitrary decision in the first place? So you've identified, well, perhaps it's media, or perhaps it's a story that you heard growing up. And it's just important to ask, who got to decide that? Who gets to state what the right relationship with food is, what the right amount of food to have in the house is? Where does that come from? So that, I think, is the first question, is who decides what that dialogue looks like in our relationship with having food stored?
Great question. Thanks so much for that. I think that question of who decides is a question that helps us to understand, where did our decisions come from? Where have they been created, and what are we going to do about them? For anybody who's listening, for anybody who's watching, going, yeah, this resonates. I get a bit of this. I'm curious about this. This is important to me. You might be really interested in some work that Natalie and I are doing, beyond the fact that we have a big, audacious goal to help 10,000 families become engaged in food security, and another 1,000 become more food secure this year. We have a program that I think you might really enjoy. It's called Family Food Security, and it's a step-by-step walk beside. We help you build an understanding of how much food your family eats, and from those numbers, then getting a sense of, am I going to grow it? Am I going to trade for it? Am I going to purchase it? Am I going to create relationships, forage, hunt? All of those pieces, but to really take on your food security and, dare I say, food sovereignty, to be able to build more capacity around your food. It runs for 7 months, starts in February, ends in September. And if you're that type of person that goes, I'd rather do that myself, I don't need to be guided, that's fine, that's good, I just want the information, you can do that too. We have a family food security DIY. And on both of these courses, there is a free module, which is a full hour and a half of Natalie and I talking about food security, Natalie talking about her journey, us talking about processes, about how to build food security and food sovereignty. So if the courses aren't for you, it may be a great way to build your food security and food sovereignty in short order. And remember, it's always a good time to focus on your food security. And we hope to see you in another video.